appreciate everyone who comes and participates. Um, I'm always very happy. So many people, just here with your cameras on. It's great. Although when I do start sharing my screen, I can't see you anymore. So if you want to turn your camera off, it doesn't bother me one bit. Just FYI. So, all right. Also, just want to say, like last week, I am on a hotspot again this week. If it cuts off, I'll jump right back on. I've got great service. Sometimes, hotspots can just have a mind of their own. So bear with me and we'll get through this. And let me share my screen. The recording did start. You guys saw that, I'm sure. And we are launching in to shadow work. That's the name of the seminar, I guess, if you want to call it that. And today we're looking at we're picking up part 2 of chapter 11. And so the title of the chapter is The Archetype of the Alcoholic. We're talking kind of in a broader picture about the thirst for wholeness. And so we want to begin to uncover what wholeness means. And because another name for this part, this chapter, this part could also be paradoxical images of wholeness, or the fusion of the opposites, right? So, last week we introduced this concept with Jung's phrase to Bill Wilson regarding Roland's craving for alcohol in the 1961 letters, where Jung told Bill that Roland's craving was on a low level, in essence, the spiritual thirst of our being for wholeness. So in this sense, then wholeness equates with completeness, and it's actually a fusion of the opposites in contrast to what we typically think of wholeness, which is sort of this fixation with being good or being moral or being ethical or whatever that is. So we're actually looking for a more broad experience that combines both aspects of our being. So that's kind of the foundation of what we're looking at. So we introduced the archetype of the alcoholic, and we've used a symbol to really try to examine that archetype, that symbol being the anonymous alcoholic, which is a mytho-psychological character that appeared in Bill Wilson's mind when he wrote the big book. So this character is the we of Alcoholics Anonymous. That's the first sentence in There's a Solution. It's also the first sentence in the preface to the first edition, and it also, of course, the we is the word that prefaces each of the 12 steps. So this is a we character. It's I'm calling it a mythological character, and what I want to say here, which is something that's kind of struck me recently, is that the characters that we're looking at in terms of mythology are the same characters that appear to us in our dreams. I want to kind of make that point, because these characters, this is the essence of an archetype, right? Is that these are universal symbols and universal energies. And so what we're going to see too is that even the archetype of the alcoholic itself is just an iteration of other religious symbols, all right? And these will all appear to us in our dreams and our fantasies, whatever it is. So, and underlying these universal symbols is what we've been looking at, is this energy, right? So I've said this over and over. I want to kind of emphasize it, is that underneath all energetic systems are a positive and a negative pole, and that also includes the spiritual realm of the spiritual power that we're seeking. There's a positive and a negative energy, right? And that these images that sort of are representations of this energy, Jung said that they are autonomous psychic complexes. So in other words, that means that the symbols for these energies, they're literally sort of living a life of their own in the realm of the unconscious. And so when they appear to us in our dreams, or for example, in Wilson's active imagination of the big book, right? What we see is that these images are sort of on their own journey, on their own quest for transformation. and on their own quest for expression in consciousness, right? And that's what it means to make the darkness conscious. So again, these images will express themselves through dreams, but they also express themselves through through myth, right? Myth is the collective dream, if you will. So the dream is the individual's personal myth, whereas in broad terms, myth is the collective dream of a group of people. And so and another way that these symbols are these kind of activated components of the unconscious. And another way that we can bring them about is through a process called active imagination. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because it was an important process in Bill Wilson's writing of the Big Book and the 12 and 12, and he says that to us. Also, my writing of Shadow of a Figure Life was also an active imagination. So, and where this comes from is when Jung was writing the Big Book, he was really wrestling with the unconscious. He was diving deep, and he was having this really hard, terrible experience. Probably something similar to what many of us have experienced as we were trying to get through the doors of the 12-step fellowship, right? Just really dark, really, really despairing, incomprehensible demoralization. And this is what Jung says about that period of time. He says, to the extent, so he's describing this process that he used to get through it. He says, to the extent that I managed to translate the emotions into images, that is, to find the images which were concealed in the emotions, I was inwardly calmed and reassured. Had I left those images hidden in the emotions, I might have been torn to pieces by them. As a result of my experience, I learned how helpful it can be from the therapeutic point of view to find the particular images which lie behind emotions. So this is active imagination, right? The way it works is we kind of quiet ourselves, we figure out what emotions we're feeling, especially negative emotions, and then we try to imagine an image associated with the emotion. So, and what's happening here is we're sort of going backwards. Okay, so in the first half of the book, the first few chapters, we were taking a journey kind of within, and the first thing we encountered was the God image. Then we get to the shadow. Then we go into the collective unconscious, down to the energies, right? And we saw that symbols are shaped energies. So what we're doing now is we're sort of working backwards, and we're saying, okay, there's this energy that's manifesting as an emotion. Now I'm going to actively give that energy a shape, and that's called active imagination. And this is a really powerful method of contemplation. I just want to tell you guys a quick story just of my own that happened recently. So you guys, many of you probably know, Ming and I's business is really struggling. We're kind of like, our sales have plummeted like 75% year over year. And we're scrambling to just like make it, and like just making huge changes. Needless to say, there's a lot of anxiety and sort of financial stress that's going along with this. So I stumbled across this concept of active imagination. I mean, I've known about it, but I decided to put it into practice. I think it was November, maybe it was October. And so I just was like, okay, I feel anxiety. So I imagined an image, and the image that appeared was a pig, like a cartoon pig dressed up in a tuxedo with like a top hat and like a cane. That was the image that I associated with the emotion. And I sort of like, I was like, well, that doesn't really make sense. So I kind of set it on the back burner for a couple of days. But this emotion was kicking my ass. Like I was just like really overwhelmed by this stress and anxiety. So I decided to kind of revisit that emotion. And I did some reading about pigs, and then I noticed that they were like these sacrificial animals, et cetera, et cetera. And so then what I did was I imagined that this pig was being sacrificed on a flame. And so the pig was burning, and the fat, the fat and the toxins from its skin were sort of melting into the flames, and they were going up into the heavens as sort of this, they were a sweet smell to the gods, right? And this all felt really interesting, but what's really, and by the way, too, those toxins, right? That fattiness really came to represent the role that I've played in our financial stress, right? Like I've made decisions based on self that have placed us in a position to be hurt, et cetera, right? So I was taking ownership of that, and then sort of sacrificing this to the gods. Needless to say, though, the really more destructive components of that emotion that was just kicking my ass from day to day, minute to minute, it sort of evaporated. And while I still feel some financial strain, it doesn't have the same sort of obsessive compulsive nature that it did before. So that's just one of the stories that I have about active imagination. And I wanted to share it just because I find it to be, I would feel like I'm doing you guys a disservice if I didn't explain what this was, because it's actually so effective. Um, the reason I have this picture here, this is Moses, and it supposedly it's Moses, but and he's holding the statue with the bronze snake on it. So if you recall from the Old Testament, when 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 God told the children of Israel to leave Egypt, they went out and wandered around in the wilderness for 40 years. And at a certain point, poisonous snakes came slithering into camp, and God told Moses to basically forge a bronze statue and put it on a stick and then hold it up. And so if anyone was bitten by a poisonous snake, all they had to do was look at the snake that was being held in the air, and then they wouldn't die from the snake bite. And this is a really good symbol, a mythological image of active imagination, right? Because the snake, and we're going to see snakes come up again and again. This whole presentation today is, I guess it's kind of holographic. There's a lot of levels. As I was preparing it, I looked at it last night. I was like, wow, this thing, it runs in a lot of different levels. So the snake is one of those levels, but the snake is a representation of the unconscious, right? It's the unconscious psyche, that animalistic instinct that's sort of like next to the ground, like very ancient, right? That ancient energy. Snakes, dragons, they're the same thing. And so, and then the image of then creating a snake into form with bronze and then holding it up on a staff and then using that as salvation against the snake on the ground that's biting, that's a good symbol of how active imagination and just symbols in general work, right? As we hold these images up, so as the unconscious component becomes conscious and it's held up to vision, and we begin to see this thing, then it's a symbol of bringing unconscious components or unconscious, energies into consciousness and then getting relief from them. That's literally that is the process of the entire psychic change. And we've talked about this in the past, but each of the 12 steps is one of these methods of active imagination and bringing unconscious components into consciousness. So with that, I want to look at one of the images that came into my mind through the active imagination of my writing the book Shadow of Your Life. And that image is the alcoholic, right? The archetype of the alcoholic. And so I mentioned that Bill used active imagination too. So he said when he wrote 12 Steps and 12 Traditions specifically that he had channeled an ancient, I think 15th century monk named Boniface, that he was channeling this monk, and that's how he wrote the book. That is an active imagination. And Wilson might have borrowed that because he did receive some Jungian analysis in the 40s. So it's pretty likely that his Jungian therapist would have mentioned active imagination to him, and then he used it. Also I want to say this, Ming pointed this out to me the other day. So I've introduced the concept of the archetype of the alcoholic, and while I've heard that it's been mentioned here and there, possibly by a couple of other authors, very kind of brief mentions, nobody has really delved into this archetype and really fleshed it out the way I have. And Ming pointed out why, and I think it's really critical as we kind of go into this, is that as we've seen, archetypes have a double nature. They have a highest and a lowest. They have a good and a bad. They have positive and negative, light and dark. In terms of the alcoholic as an archetype, the reason nobody ever gave it any real attention was because they can't imagine that this archetype would actually have a positive side, right? The alcoholic trope is so deeply ingrained that there could be no good spirituality or transformation. That the outside, like we can see this in here, right? But we understand things in here on this intuitive level that the normies don't really get. And this is one of them, right? Is this the dualistic nature of the alcoholic as an archetype. So, and I had, as I was writing this, I had a flash of insight, because I read Jung's essay on the psychology of the trickster figure, and I noticed that, see, the trickster it becomes a symbol of the archetype. And so this it's really like a mirror image of the archetype of the alcoholic, right? The trickster is an archetype, the alcoholic is an archetype. And so this becomes an access point where normies can begin to understand what we mean when we talk about alcoholism and the archetype of the alcoholic. So it allows them to understand the disease of alcoholism in a much more profound way. And I've gotten feedback from therapists who aren't in the program, who work with a lot of addicts and stuff, and they're really blown away by this concept because they had never really had access to it before, and this is helping them to come to understand it. So Jung said that the phantom of the trickster haunts the mythologies of every age. And so that means that the trickster shows up in every myth in one guise or another, right? He shows up in the Garden of Eden as the snake. He shows up in Jesus's life as the devil. And in modern days, he shows up in society as the alcoholic, the archetype of the alcoholic. In this paragraph right here, and this is in the book, Shadow of Fear. This is where I relate the alcoholic and the trickster together. So this is what it says. In the big book, Wilson describes the alcoholic dilemma as a self-imposed crisis that we can neither postpone nor evade. As the dilemma deepens, alcoholics are forced to delude themselves more and more to justify behaving in ways that contradict their values, chipping away at their moral character. Sometimes they set their moral compass aside when they are under the influence, but real self-imposed psychological damage is done when they do so in a state of abstinence in order to get more booze. At first, they fool themselves into thinking that they choose to behave in such a self-destructive way. But the truth is far more insidious, for they are really being compelled by a shadow complex tied to an archetype Jung aptly named the trickster in a 1954 essay on the psychology of the trickster figure. The trickster, an ancient variation of the archetype of the alcoholic, bedevils us into believing we are making choices when really we are being driven by an element of unconscious instinct, the intangible thirst for union with God. And since this particular facet of the shadow complex is so apparent in the life of an alcoholic, there is a clear correlation between the typical alcoholic trope and the shadow figure of the trickster. Both represent, as Jung says, quote, a summation of all the inferior traits of character in individuals. And so, if we're trying to get to a more clear understanding of what the shadow is, we can use this archetype, this image of the alcoholic as a very sort of good guidepost and kind of map as we try to uncover what the shadow is. Now, the next paragraph, and this is also just in the book. So the next paragraph touches, so the trickster was an animalistic character, and this paragraph, so and that ties to alcoholism quite well, at least in my story. And this is what it says. Comparing Jung's commentary on the trickster to the archetype of the alcoholic thus helps to illuminate the compulsive parts of the psyche that tend to remain hidden from the ego's view. Jung said that the trickster is half animal, half divine, something that can also be said of the alcoholic archetype, considering just how savage its animalistic half can be. The alcoholic sets a deadly trap in alcoholics' lives, meant to awaken them to an awareness of their intangible spiritual thirst, if it doesn't kill them first. We see this same disregard for the ego's suffering, as well as for life itself, in the machinations of the trickster, who, playing a similar role in the spiritual awakening, masterminds the debacle that reveals our unconscious longing for wholeness. This is, Jung says, only out of disaster can the longing for the Savior arise. In other words, the recognition and unavoidable integration of the shadow creates such a harrowing situation that nobody but a Savior can undo the tangled web of fate. In other words, the whole point of the trickster, right, is that it drives a person into a situation where their own ego and their own rationale cannot get them out of the problem. And that the trickster it's part of the self, and it masterminds this debacle. And it forces one into an unavoidable integration of the shadow. That's what's happened to most people who finally crawl into a 12-step fellowship. In the mythos, I'm reading again, in the mythos of the alcoholic, the bottle becomes a symbol of the deadly weapon that the trickster complex assaults us with. as it tries to beat us into a state of reasonableness regarding our need to relinquish the delusion of control. Uninterested in whether one survives the attack, the alcoholic archetype is only concerned with collapsing the ego. Regardless if they live or die, alcoholics are fated to encounter the awful image of themselves in the mirror held up by the objective psyche. As harrowing as it sounds, according to those who made it safely through, it was worth the risk, for it brings with it a tremendous gift, the ability to comprehend the great reality and to enjoy the world from the perspective of one who has died spiritually and been reborn. So, the trickster then is a way for us to understand, or for normies too, to understand the insidious aspect of alcoholism, right? Its sort of violent and deadly components, and underlying this side of the archetype of the alcoholic is this animalistic, instinctual kind of energy, right? I know for me personally, when I was craving for alcohol or whatever, obsessing of the mind or whatever it was, there was a certain sort of, it just didn't matter like who I ran over or what I did or who I hurt in order to get what I needed and get what I wanted. And the only way I could really relate that is to say that it was an instinctual drive. But what Jung has helped me understand is that it was, the instinct was for the thirst. It was a thirst for wholeness, right? I was equating it with alcohol, which worked for a while, but really the whole thing, this whole debacle that's being masterminded in my life is actually to quench the thirst for wholeness. I like this symbol. This is from the tarot. This is the Fool. So the Fool, he's about to step off a cliff. He's got his little dog with him. This is a variation of this trickster archetype or this alcoholic archetype. And the yellow is a representation of the prima materia, which is, so, and we're going to come up against this later. It's like sulfur, right? Yep, sulfur is yellow, and that's the substance that needs to be transformed. So, and we're going to talk about this. I want to introduce some alchemy in here because the archetype of the alcoholic is so intertwined with this alchemical symbolism. I didn't put a lot of that stuff in the book, but since you're here today or listening, I'm going to try to bring that stuff about, and really it does tie into Jung's letter to Wilson, as we'll see a little bit later. Now, so like the alcoholic, the Fool represents the word. Okay, so I want to say this too, because the Fool in tarot is a representation, and this is a great symbol of the alcoholic as well. The Fool represents sort of this its potential, right? The Fool represents potential, the potential of having an experience or having a change, right? So it's like, for my Bible loving friends, it's John chapter 1 verses 1 through 3, right? In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So the Fool then is really the representation of the Word before it was made flesh, right? It's this sort of potential. It's this unconscious energy that's sort of swirling around. And that's also what the trickster represents, right? Because the trickster undergoes, and this is the key about this, the trickster undergoes a transformation. The trickster becomes the shaman. That is the myth of the shaman, is that it was at one time a trickster. And so what happens then is the trickster kind of bumbles his way into and becomes the wounded healer. And I want to point this out too, that if we're talking about psychological energies, right, these archetypes are these bundles of psychic energy, then not only does the trickster become the shaman in the exterior world, right, but that's also what's happening on the inside, right? So as the trickster or the alcoholic complex goes through these changes on the interior, it also takes place in the exterior. So these as within, so without. And this is what I say in the book. According to the second law of spiritual dynamics, the archetype of the alcoholic has autonomy over all of the psychic functions, which is why alcoholics tend to do everything alcoholically, and why when they have a spiritual awakening, it usually revolutionizes their entire life inside and out. Having been led directly into the depths of the psyche by the evil spirits contained in the bottle, what we're going to call spiritum, the alcoholic emerges with a spiritual vocation to guide others towards spiritus, the breath of life or the Holy Spirit. A similar dynamic plays out in indigenous cultures, ancient and modern, where the trickster of the tribe is often called to be its medicine man or woman, having learned to integrate the more depraved parts of themselves. Jung says, there is something of the trickster in the character of the shaman and medicine man. He is the wounded wounder who becomes the agent of healing, the sufferer who takes away suffering and who turns the meaningless into the meaningful. By overcoming one's own demons, the shaman learns from practical experience how to guide others to do the same. Escaping a previous way of life dominated by instinct, the shaman masters the magic art of healing, which in the context of spirituality is only discovered by ingesting the most depraving poison, metaphorically speaking. The alcoholic is thus a shapeshifter, and as the carrier of spiritual boons becomes the symbol of the savior, the bringer of healing to the tribe, an element of which clearly constellated in Wilson's mind when he devised the anonymous alcoholic's heroic adventure through the 12 steps, ending with his 12th suggestion that after one has had a spiritual awakening, one carries a message of wholeness to others suffering a similar fate. So, the second law of spiritual dynamics is the one that states that the transformative energy of an archetype is activated by its inherent polarity, which means that the dual nature of these archetypes, that they have a higher and a lower aspect, is what gives them so much transformative power and what gives them autonomy over the entire psyche, good and bad. And by the way, this is an image of the staff of Hermes. Hermes was the Greek name for the Roman god called Mercury, who is also an alchemical character, who is also a representation of the trickster and the alcoholic. And so if we understand that, then that means that this symbol right here, which is such a common symbol, is actually a pretty interesting representation or illustration of the archetype of the alcoholic. They're both stemming out of the same sort of unconscious complex. And so what we have here, so remember too, Moses held up the snake. Here we have the same symbol, basically, that there's a staff, which is that's the magic wand in tarot. It's a symbol of sort of like energy, like the dynamic of, like, you know, like a magic wand can turn something and transform it. Then we also have two different snakes climbing the staff, right? That's an image of the highest and the lowest. And then there's also another symbol of, we have the snake in contrast to the wings, right? Which that's also a symbol of the highest and the lowest as the transformation, right? This the snake gets its wings and can fly. So there's some underlying symbolism here of the slaying of the dragon too, right? Whereas the snake is a representation of the dragon. I think it's important to point out that slaying the dragon in popular culture often stands for getting clean and sober. So there's other sort of underlying meanings in all of these images. When we begin to understand the archetype of the alcoholic, we can see it. Now, the archetype of the alcoholic then is a paradoxical image of wholeness. And that means that it's meant to elicit a sensation of wholeness in us, right? And so this if you have or have had, you know, alcoholism, or you suffer from alcoholism or drug addiction or whatever it is, most likely if you're in the 12-step fellowships, then the concept of the archetype of the alcoholic, once we begin to understand its dualistic nature, it will elicit a sense of wholeness, which I think is why this particular chapter of the book is so moving for people in the program, because it really speaks to something deeper in us and calls out this really ugly, hard, difficult experience that we've had. It puts it in the context of this overall transformation in a different way. And this, we're going to talk more and more about this as we go. In the book, I say, as an image of wholeness, the alcoholic archetype encompasses the utter darkness and depravity of the most loathsome human condition, but it also represents a metamorphosis, just like the trickster transforms into a shaman. And it assumes humanity's highest spiritual aspirations at the same time. And that's an important phrase. That's why I put it in italics, right? And I'm going to try to uncover what I mean by that as we go. The antithetical nature of archetypal images such as the alcoholic and the trickster elucidate how deeply dependent we are upon the tension of opposites within the psyche for an entire psychic change to occur. Painful though it is, the terrible dilemma unleashed by the alcoholic is what ultimately leads to wholeness, no matter how lost or unconscious one might have been. Like the trickster, the alcoholic is a negative hero who manages to achieve through stupidity what others fail to accomplish with their best efforts. Now, Jung said that about the trickster, and it applies perfectly to the alcoholic. Once overrun by the instinctual, amoral aspects of their own humanity, sober alcoholics have undeservedly, as if by divine accident, redeemed themselves, stumbling upon a path to authentic spirituality in the midst of a culture where the ancient wisdom of searching for meaning and value within the darkest parts of one's own being has all but vanished. By bringing with them an irrational cure, they inadvertently shapeshift into real-life shamans, having gained the knowledge of how to help those whom modern medicine, psychiatry, and religion are unable to reach. Being fooled first by the trickster in their own minds, and later their sponsors, who also embody the shamanistic element of the trickster, sober alcoholics reconcile what was previously irreconcilable within them and within the culture, I would say, fumbling their way toward enlightenment with the calling to help others to do the same. And so what we have is that the alcoholic experiences a transformation just the same way the trickster does, right? And in so doing, they put themselves in a position, the alcoholic, the archetype of the alcoholic specifically becomes a healer, right? Both individually as well as collectively. Such paradoxical images are depictions of the fusion of opposites. If you recall, Jung had said to Jaime back in the 20s that he needed to figure out how to fuse the opposites that were sort of defining his life. So so these paradoxical images then are sort of they are descriptions. They're describing what it means to fuse the opposites, what Jung called the conjunctio oppositorum. And so you might hear me say that, or you might just hear me refer to it as the conjunctio. That means the fusion of opposites. That's how we're sort of defining that. This is, and we're going to see this as we get into chapters 12 and 13. The conjunctio was a Gnostic idea that grew parallel to Christian dogmatism, and it comes as a response to Christianity's extreme fixation with the images of light, and it's a response to a doctrine called the Privato Boni, which we're going to talk about in chapter 13, right? Which sort of diminishes the concept of evil, which is bad because it creates more evil in the shadow. It strengthens the shadow, right? So the conjunctio was a Gnostic idea that the alchemists later would pick up, that is meant to challenge that and sort of get back to the basic structure of the psyche, which we saw in chapter 10, is really this dynamism, right? This good and bad. Like every human being is a mixture of good and bad. We're not just good, we're not just bad. And so the conjunctio is meant to bring about the fusion of those opposites. And the archetype of the alcoholic, once we understand its dualistic nature, is probably the most readily accessible symbol of the conjunctio that we have, because it's just so clear once you get it. This is what I say in shadow. The mythos of the alcoholic illustrates how the human need for genuine spiritual connection only becomes apparent after one escapes the deadly psychological trap set by the trickster under the villainous guise of managing well. The web that fate uses to ensnare alcoholics is woven of the same paradoxical thread that comprises everything in the universe, and as the alcoholic drama unfolds, they discover that the only panacea is found in a fusion of the opposites. Exactly what Jung referred to when he encouraged Jaime to integrate his conception of the primitive in his quest to carve out a meaningful role for himself in Western culture. So if we go back to Jaime was a little too drawn to the darkness, which many alcoholics and drug addicts are, right? And I think on the flip side, right, in culture, like too many people are sort of drawn to the light, right? And so what happens then is this, there's kind of this unbalance, right? And we unconsciously identify with either this or that. And by doing so, we're not honoring wholeness, and we're not achieving wholeness, right? The goal is wholeness. And so what emerges here is what Jung called a quaternity symbol. And I'm going to use this form for a couple slides this afternoon, just to because I think it's really useful. I didn't do any of this in the book, but I was trying to just keep it real smooth, and so people could just kind of blast through it. But really underlying these ideas is these quaternity symbols. So this is a great way to visualize the fusion of the opposites, right? And so Jung drew these symbols. These symbols will appear in dreams. They're really important psychologically speaking. They really talk. There's so much that can be said about them. But what it is at first glance, what we see here is that there's this conjunction, right? And we're sort of looking for that middle point. So this symbol in particular, don't stress too much about those words if you don't know what they are, but those are actually the 4 rivers that run out of the Garden of Eden. And so Jung pointed out that the Garden of Eden represents a mandala, right? That the tree of life is in the middle, and that there's 4 rivers that run out of the garden to different directions. And so like if something like this were to appear in a dream, it would be considered like a mandala symbol, and you could really look at the Garden of Eden to try to figure out what the dream means. But what happens in the garden, it's really important because there's also the introduction of the opposites in the garden. We're going to talk about this in chapter 15. So it's like everything is one in the garden, right? But then they start to partake of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and then opposites begin to enter, and more opposites enter until finally it cascades so badly that they have to leave the presence of God, right? So the final opposition is that there's God and man. So and again, if we're talking about the archetype of the alcoholic, it's all kind of the same symbolism, right? And it's these quaternity symbols that are kind of playing out. So the next image, let me just read this by Jung. It says the quaternity always represents consciously reflected and differentiated, a consciously reflected and differentiated totality that appears in dreams as an expression of the total personality. So if in your own dreams you're beginning to have like if images like this are coming up, and you're seeing, like, 4 rivers, 4 directions, shapes like this, crosses, right? It could be any number of things that would represent this quaternity. That's a really good sign. Dreams kind of give us an untarnished view of what's taking place on the inside. Probably more insightful than our sponsors or our therapists or anything, right? Is our own dreams are going to tell us what's happening inside of us, right? Which is really important. Like if we're having really disturbing dreams all the time and stuff, like that means there's work to be done. But you want to keep an eye out for these kinds of dreams. Now, and I'm going to show this one. So this really is the quaternity then that emerged in shadow of a figure of light. And what we have here is it's pretty simple to understand once we see it through this light. On one hand, we have the trickster who transforms into a shaman, right? On that vertical plane, the trickster becomes a shaman. And then on the left, we have the active alcoholic who transforms into a sober alcoholic, right? So this represents a quaternity. And it's an easy way to understand how within the psyche, these two things sort of, they interact in the psyche, and this is what happens. It really elucidates a transformation on the outside. All right, so we're going to kind of pivot now. We're going back to Jung's letter to Wilson. With that base, we're ready to dig into this a little deeper. So we have this archetype of the alcoholic, and if we combine, so Wilson, in tradition 12, Wilson basically says that anonymity is the spiritual foundation of all our traditions, or we could just say it's the spiritual foundation. It is our spiritual foundation. And I appreciate Patrick pointed this out last week, right? That anonymity is sort of this, it's an underlying kind of archetypal notion, right? And that what and really it states that we're all sort of having the same experience. So on one hand, then, in terms of the archetype of the alcoholic, we have this universal sort of experience. And that's one way in which the archetype manifests in the alcoholic. There's another aspect of the archetype of the alcoholic that also, and by the way, too, Jung's statement that Roland's craving for alcohol is the equivalent on a low level of the spiritual thirst of our being for wholeness. That's the universal kind of pattern of the archetype of the alcoholic. Jung's letter to Wilson also states this. And this becomes kind of more kind of theoretical soil out of which this archetype emerges, right? And this is what it says. You see, and this is what Jung tells this to Bill on the last paragraph of the letter. He says, you see, alcohol in Latin is spiritus, and use the same word for the highest religious experience as well as the most depraved poison. The helpful formula, therefore, is spiritus contra spiritum. And I want to point this out because I don't think most people who have read this letter or are unfamiliar with Carl Jung and his writings in general. So Jung really didn't do a lot of homework for his readers. He expected his readers to do the homework. He really just presented the ideas, especially in his later life. He just puts the ideas out there and you've got to do the background to try to figure out what he's saying. This is no different. This phrase right here is no different. He even calls it the helpful formula, as if to tell Bill, well, hey, if you really want to understand this stuff, start here, right? Like, and I also can't help but think that when he writes helpful formula, he's speaking of a formula in terms of like a recipe, because of the Latin here, the use of the word poison, the highest, the lowest, these are all alchemical kind of terms. And so I think what Jung was doing here was sort of trying to turn Wilson on to this, the concept of alchemy, how these alchemical symbols can help to elucidate alcoholism, which it happens to take place through the archetype of the alcoholic. And so basically we're going to spend the rest of the session kind of trying to dismantle this cryptic statement. This is what I say in the book just to get it started, right after I quote that. Spiritus contra spiritum is typically understood to mean to counter alcoholism with spirituality. And yet the phrase suggests far more than what a perfunctory translation of the Latin would imply. It is an adage regarding the paradoxical nature of the conjunctio that takes place in recovery from alcoholism. Expressive of the union of opposites embodied by the archetype of the alcoholic, spiritus contra spiritum refers to the conjunction of the highest religious experience with that of the most depraved human condition. This means that the negative aspect of the archetype of the alcoholic, which spurs one on to commit what will be atrocious acts, becomes the cornerstone upon which their spiritual experience is built, the pathology itself integral to their quest for enlightenment. Jung says this: inasmuch as you attain to the numinous experiences, you are released from the curse of pathology. So that's really saying that if we can get a spiritual experience, right, we get released from pathology, which is really basic 12-step kind of dogma. But then he says even the very disease takes on a numinous character. And that's the part that I really want to highlight, right? Is that we can even see active alcoholism or active drug addiction as part of the numinosity of the experience, right? I'll keep reading. As a person begins to attribute both the conflict as well as the solution to the driving force of the numinosum, part and parcel of their personal adventure, alcoholics awaken to the notion that what they had hoped to assuage through spirits can only be fully sated by union with spiritus, at which point their entire life becomes imbued with meaning and value, including their dark history and active alcoholism. And so I think a helpful way to understand the phrase spiritus contra spiritum is because we want to think it's just like, oh yeah, spirituality against alcoholism, right? Like that's how we tend to kind of, I mean, that's how the lay people are going to translate this. but I think it goes way deeper than that. And I think a helpful way to kind of approach this in the beginning is just to understand, first of all, that the word contra doesn't necessarily mean in it, like, I think the best way to see it is to mean opposite of, right? That or in that spirit and spirit, these are opposites, right? And when we understand Jungian psychology, right, we see that the opposites play an equal role. One is not better than the other, right? They're both required to create this spiritual power, this spiritual energy of the numinosity. Jung gives us the central meaning of the spiritus contra spiritum paradox when he says even the disease takes on a numinous character. He might as well, and like I said, he might as well just be describing recovery from alcoholism with that phrase, because it means, and because what's happening here, it's the animalistic aspect. It gets fused with the highest religious experience. That the two things, this is what we're trying to fuse together, which it's a paradox, right? This whole thing is paradoxical. It's not meant to make any sense. And so if you're having a hard time understanding it, that's by design. Not my design. It's just the nature of the unconscious. That's how it is. Again, these symbols are reflections of things that are taking place in the realm of the unconscious or the realm of the spiritual. In alchemy, the fusion of the opposites manifested the birth of a new creature who is called Mercurius. And again, Mercurius is another ancient variation of the archetype of the alcoholic, just like the trickster. So Jung said that the trickster equals Mercurius. I'm saying the trickster equals Mercurius equals the alcoholic. And so if we go back to the staff of Hermes, right, that is Hermes is Mercury. They're the same being. And the reason I point this out is because in this quote from Ettinger, I've basically swapped out the term Mercurius and just put in the alcoholic, right? Because this is a great description of what the archetype of the alcoholic is and what it represents. And I'll read it now. It says, this is Ettinger. He says, you must always remember that the alcoholic is the personification of the autonomous unconscious. The alcoholic in its original form, meaning the practicing alcoholic, is the unconscious in its original state. It's sort of that primitive, archaic, animalistic, instinctual drive. The alcoholic is the lapis, meaning the transformed alcoholic, is the unconscious when the ego has related to it consciously. In other words, you've done a step one. That's literally like, that can be boiled down to step one. Out of the original alcoholic, or the practicing alcoholic, that experience, Sol, meaning sun, and Luna, meaning moon, emerge as the pair of opposites. When these opposites are again united, they give birth to the sun, the filius, that means the sun, which is the equivalent to the lapis. In other words, so in alchemy, what was born from this conjunction of opposites, right? It was, and they're two disparate objects, right? The moon and the sun, two total opposites. Luna and Sol are absolute opposites, right? When these converge, then what is born is a child called Mercurius. And what we can say is, in terms of the alcoholic, right? What the alcoholic literally is born out of our working the steps and making consciousness and unconscious and the unconscious unite. So we saw this way back in chapter 3 when we were looking at Carl Jung's own myth. And maybe you can go back and read it. But basically, Carl Jung's own myth was that he kind of adopted from the Taoists, was that the sun crosses the sky, and that the ego, if the human beings who help Father Sun cross the sky are representative of the ego, then the differentiated ego's job is to sort of help to disseminate this knowledge, right? And to spread knowledge. And so fundamentally, then the myth is to make the unconscious conscious. The same thing is what takes place in the 12 steps, especially just starting with step 1. We suffer from an unconscious delusion, right? An unconscious craving. And as we make that unconscious craving conscious, then we overcome the pathology. And so, and and what happens from that is a new creature, right? Wilson's the one that he says we were reborn. That rebirth is symbolized by the alcoholic. Now, and I apologize for that ugly big white streak. I didn't notice that was there. But what we're fusing together, right, are these fundamental energetic dynamics of the psyche. So really what it is on one hand we have instinct, right? And we're talking about spiritus contra spiritum. So on one hand we have the instinct, the animalistic nature of the trickster, and then on the other hand we have spirit, right? It could be the Holy Ghost. It could be whatever it is, the universal mind, all of that stuff. So these are the two things that we're trying to bring together, right? One is the unconscious and one is consciousness. And the next quote, so I want to read this quote because it really helps to elucidate this stuff. And I actually, I cut this quote out of the book at like literally the very last minute. I only kept one tiny phrase, both can be both. I had the whole thing in there before, but it seemed like too much for people to wade through, so I cut it. But I want to present it here because it really helps to elucidate what we're dealing with when we're talking about spiritus contra spiritum and how, and I love that Jung in this comment, he uses the word ism, the same way we use ism, right? That we suffer from this ism and that this ism is highly related to the archetypes. So this is how the quote reads. In spite of, or perhaps because of its affinity with instinct, the archetype represents the authentic element of spirit, but a spirit which is not to be identified with the human intellect since it is the latter's guiding light, or spiritus rector. The essential content of all mythologies and all religions and all isms is archetypal. The archetype is spirit or anti-spirit. What it ultimately proves to be depends on the attitude of the human mind. Archetype and instinct are the most polar opposites imaginable, as can easily be seen when one compares a man who is ruled by his instinctual drives, the practicing alcoholic, with a man who is seized by the spirit, the recovered alcoholic. But just as between all opposites there obtains so close a bond that no position can be established or even thought of without its corresponding negation, so in this case also les extrêmes se touchent, meaning the opposites are so close that they could touch. They belong together as correspondences, which is not to say that the one is derivable from the other, but that they subsist side by side as reflections in our own minds of the opposition that underlies all psychic energy. That's a really important phrase. What he's saying here is that in terms of the spiritual awakening that we have in step 12, that our tendency will be to say that, so the way we try to logically fuse the opposites is to say that the spiritual awakening derived out of out of step 1, which is not to say that it's not true, right? But what Jung is saying is that there's something even more profound happening, is that these two concepts, these two things, they exist, they belong together as correspondences, right? And that they are reflections of the opposition that underlies our own psychic energy. And they just are manifesting at different times in space. But in the eternal realm of the unconscious, they're basically one and the same. So I'm reading again, man finds himself simultaneously driven to act and free to reflect. This contrariety of his nature has no moral significance, for instinct is not in itself bad any more than spirit is good. Both can be both. Negative electricity is as good as positive electricity. First and foremost, it is electricity. The psychological opposites, too, must be regarded from a scientific standpoint. True opposites are never incommensurables. If they were, they could never unite. All contrariety notwithstanding, they do show a constant propensity to union, and Nicholas of Susa, an alchemist, defined God himself as a complexio oppositorum. He might actually be a Gnostic. I don't remember. So, in other words, then, the key phrase out of here is that both can be both, right? And that the numinous then, it sort of encompasses both sides of this spiritual equation that we're looking at, the highest and the lowest. And that there's an element of compulsion, right, that takes place in both. And that's really the nature of this, of us trying to fuse the opposites, this spiritus contra spiritum. All right. I'm going to skip this one, just so that, because we're running a little low on time, and I just have a few more slides to go. So, but this brings us then to this next quaternity, right? So what we're looking at is, in terms of spirituality and stuff, and this compulsive nature, we have instinct sort of on the bottom, running below the surface of consciousness, and then up above we have these images. So if we go back to the snake, with Moses in the desert, we have the instinctual snake crawling on the ground, and then the image held up, right? That is the symbol of the snake. And then on the other hand, we have spiritus and spiritum, right? And so there's a transformation. These things they sort of work on this. It's a quaternity, right? And these things come together, and as they sort of interact with each other, they create. This is what wholeness looks like. These paradoxical images of wholeness will very often be these quaternity symbols, like theoretically speaking. So I want to talk about the mystery of compulsion in the last few slides. And we sort of introduced that last week, and we're going to talk about it again in chapter 16. The whole chapter is about the mystery of the compulsion, but it's so important I wanted to just really touch on it here, because it does, it really coincides with Jung's statement. You see alcohol in Latin as spiritus, and you use the same word for the highest religious experience, blah, 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 blah. So and this is why. So in alchemy, sulfur was the most depraving poison. That is kind of a correlation. Sulfur tarnishes any other metals that it comes in contact with. And so it played a role in these alchemical formulas, right? But sulfur was also a duplex symbol, meaning that it's just like the alcoholic and just like Mercurius, sulfur has a double meaning. Sulfur was combustible. Okay. And so when we're talking about the mystery of compulsion, when we keep in mind that if I'm just going to read the quote because Jung does a great job explaining it. The unconscious dynamism would correspond to sulfur, for compulsion is the great mystery of human life. It is the thwarting of our conscious will and of our reason by an inflammable element within us, that's sulfur, appearing now as a consuming fire and now as a life-giving warmth. So once again, we have these two opposing kind of tendencies, right? A consuming fire versus a life-giving warmth. Again, this takes place in the psyche. In terms of alcoholism, just for example, there's an element of alcoholism that did provide a life-giving warmth for me, right? Just the effect of alcohol for ease and comfort, etc. But then also on the flip side, it's an inflammable element which is essentially consumes my entire life and burns everything to the ground. I'm back to reading. This lack of freedom lies in the unconscious and forms that part of the personality which still has to be added to the conscious man in order to make him whole. Compulsion, therefore, has two sources, the shadow and the self. And so we're introducing the concept of the self here. And in terms of looking at these pathologies like alcoholism in particular or drug addiction from this Jungian perspective, right? So we see that compulsion sort of it kind of underlies the whole thing. So in all of these slides, for example, I've had this kind of yellow background. Sulfur is yellow. In alchemy, when there was a yellow background, it was representative of sulfur. The card of the Fool, if I was to scroll back, the tarot card, in that card, the sky is yellow. So that's also a representation of sulfur. So sulfur represents, on one hand, it's the arcane substance that needs to be transformed, but on the other hand, it is the transformative substance, right? It's the fire that kind of burns everything. This is what Edinger says about sulfur, and this is such good commentary on recovery that I really wanted to get this in here today. this is what Edinger says. We first experience sulfur or compulsion through the shadow. And remember, sulfur is the most depraving poison. So we're referring back to spiritus contra spiritum here. We first experience sulfur, compulsion, the most depraving poison through the shadow because sulfur is the inflammable element. But after a lengthy period of analyzing our complexes, hopefully we get to their core, which is an archetype. The archetypal energy, the fire, the sulfur that's at the root of the complexes derives from the self. Then we begin to experience compulsion, what sets us on fire, not as the product of our complexes, but as an expression of the self. And that's the key right there. That in terms of looking at alcoholism from a Jungian perspective, what's being said here is that it wasn't alcoholism per se. Alcoholism was just the fire, right? There was something deeper than that, which literally lit the fire, and that was the self. And it did this for its own kind of means and its own to bring itself into expression. And we're going to talk about that in chapter 14. So we're getting really deep into some Jungian thought here, and it's really great. Here, the important idea is that the compulsive dynamic of all complexes derives from the self. When you see that, then you don't have a complex anymore. Which doesn't mean, however, that you aren't subject to inflammable effects. Not at all. But it does mean that you are experiencing them on a deeper level and they become part of an ongoing dialogue with the self. Before one sees that such things derive from the self, one is in constant danger of being possessed by a complex. In other words, of catching on fire from the inflammability of the sulfur in the complex. So, I would suggest that the reason so many people have so much success in overcoming alcoholism and drug addiction or any other sort of compulsive behavior within the 12-step construct is because without even knowing it, we get to an archetypal sort of understanding of what's taking place because we see sort of intuitively that it was the complex that got us to really turn towards the spirit. And I think that that's really great, but I do think we kind of tend to miss this deeper level, right? Because we tend to like almost turn too much towards the 12 steps, that they are the salvation, they're the only way, and then we can miss kind of some deeper things that are happening. So we want to be careful with that. So and I think that with Spiritus contra Spiritum, Jung is really inviting us to keep going deeper, right? To get down to the archetypal level, not just of alcoholism, but really of all of our complexes. And so then basically this brings us to another quaternity, right? If we look at sulfur or compulsion, right? In terms of the life of the alcoholic or the alcoholic archetype, the anonymous alcoholic, what we have is the life-giving warmth on one hand versus the consuming fire on the other, right? The action of sulfur, the action of alcohol, the action of the self, the action of any compulsion, right? Step 6 and 7, it could be anything, right? And then on the other hand, on the horizontal plane, we have this compulsion where we're driven by 100 forms of fear, or perhaps we're suffering from the phenomenon of craving, or we still suffer from the delusion of control over ourselves or over other people, whatever that is, that compulsive complex. Then on the other side, we have what is called spiritual vocation, right? Which is literally the devotion that we automatically sort of generate when we become practicing members of a 12-step fellowship. I know for me in particular, I wasn't really interested in discipline or being a spiritual person or anything like that. Like, and so many of my friends too, like, you know, but we just, somehow we come in here and we find this sort of, I feel like it's a compulsion, right? Like vocation is not something that we necessarily choose. It's something that happens to us. It actually happens through us. You know, and it may look like discipline on the outside, but it's not. It's something more profound. It's actually the self. It's the same function that drives us towards, you know, the consuming fire. It is the same thing that provides the life-giving warmth. So those two things are correlated. Finally, this is all really to say is that, and I love this quote from Jung, in God, all opposites are abolished. And so that's really kind of the underlying message here, in terms of all of these paradoxical images of wholeness, the alcoholic, you're curious, spiritus contra spiritum, right? And then, and if we're really to look at overall the archetype of wholeness, right? And this thirst for wholeness, what happens in wholeness is that the opposites are abolished. And this is the last paragraph in the chapter. It says, and while it's perfectly normal when faced with such a paradox as the fusion of opposites, to assume that the side that represents the highest religious experience has more spiritual meaning and value than what we gain through experiencing the most depraved poison, both provide necessary and enduring lessons that become useful tools as we try to help others in the fulfillment of our newfound spiritual trade to carry the message. The alcoholic archetype, an image of wholeness, teaches us that neither is more important than the other. Jung wisely states that, ethically speaking, both can be both. The experience we garner while letting our instinct for ease and comfort lead us to the very gates of hell will have just as much impact on our continued spiritual and psychological growth as anything we learn when we finally discover heaven on earth. And I think that's what Wilson was talking about when he said our defects become our greatest assets, right? And how just this sort of collective wisdom we have about people who come into the rooms who are new and who just don't have any clue what's happening to them. And yet we can look at them and talk to them for 5 minutes and we sort of know exactly where they're at and how much danger they're in. You know, it's not like we can tell them how much danger they're in, even though we might try. But this all comes from our own experience in the darkness, right? And it's such a it's an integral part of the spiritual awakening is to have that stuff and to hold it close. We're not trying to close the door on it, as Wilson says, but we bring it with us into the realm of light. The archetype of the alcoholic reveals that the way to reconcile the opposites is to learn to see them as intrinsic to our nature, regardless of how they manifest in the outside world, and to look for the gift of transformation hidden within the worst parts of ourselves, urging us to set things right whenever we have caused harm. The alcoholic then beckons us to view our own darkness akin to the way we regard the negative charge of electricity, vital to the creation of the spiritual power needed to carry us forward. And with that, I'll go ahead and stop the sharing, and I will turn it back over to the bus driver.
Wow. Brilliant. So much. I've made it so everyone can unmute. Let's all join together in unmuting and our traditional collective expressions of appreciation. So
Yes.
Thank you, Cody.
Thank you.
Amazing, Cody. Thank you.
Amazing,
Cody. Thank you.
Thank you, Cody.
Thank you, Cody. Paul.
Thank you so much. Thank you. That's great.
Hey, thank you so much.
Thank you.
I really like this chapter. This is really well done. Thank you for presenting this to us, Cody. Now let me transition us into our Q&A period. Let me see here. Yes, this is the time we'll open for questions and answers. Each person will have about 90 seconds, a minute and a half. We've expanded that a little bit to reflect or ask a question, and Cody will do his best to answer. So again, we're recording everything. So if you don't want to be recorded, you can post your question in the chat, either directly to me or to everyone, and I'll weave those questions in to our Q&A. Or if you'd like to ask your question yourself, you can raise your hand with the raise hand function that's under reactions in the Zoom controls. And I see a hand from Martin. Martin, I'll ask you to unmute.
Oh, hi there. Yeah, great. Thanks very much for a wonderful presentation. I've done a lot of my own spiritual work over the years, but never sort of gotten anywhere with it. But tonight, what you spoke to me about really is that sort of inner world of light and darkness, and then it is all one, really. I've been studying the Hindu tradition, like with Shiva, it talks about this divine masculine and female energy, and how we sort of should be recognizing or honoring each one, really, sort of that all becomes one, and this non-duality and all that type of stuff, really. So yeah, and I've just noticed, really, I'm just really sort of new into recovery. Even though I've been doing lots of spiritual work over the years, I've only sort of come into the 12-step over the past year. And yeah, I just feel like at the moment I'm on step, well, 6, 7. I'm on, like, and what I'm still finding is this real sort of inner sort of turmoil inside. I can sit with it, I can be with it, and not act out on it, but it's very exhausting. So I just sort of almost like try to allow it to be, but it's still really difficult. And I can sort of feel this sort of fluttering inside. It's like a veil. It's like it's sort of very sort of fluttering inside. Oh, is that me done? Is it?
Do you have a question, Martin?
Yeah, it's just a comment, really. I was just sort of saying, is this normal I'm going through? Is this a normal process I'm going through? Because I'm quite new to it. Thank you.
Yes, it's normal.
Thanks, Martin.
Cody, do you think it's normal?
I do think it's normal. And I also did see Martin had put something in the chat about divine feminine and masculine energies reunite. And so that does have a question mark next to it. So maybe I'll talk about that, because I think that was what you sort of referred to. So and yes, we kind of touched on briefly the conjunction of Sol, which is the sun, and Luna, which is the moon. And in terms of Western psychology, and probably Eastern, but I'm not 100% sure, but I'm pretty sure, the sun, it would be representative of the masculine function, or of consciousness, typically. And then, Shiva or the Luna is a representation of the feminine. And so in alchemy, those two symbols would unite, typically in the form of an eclipse, right? And what would be born from that eclipse would be this new creature. And this new creature would have, so Jung uses the word hermaphrodite because it would have both male and female sexual organs. And so, and it's just it's a symbol, right? But so that it's not putting one above the other or anything. It's more about this the conjunction, right? So, and for men, we have our work to do is really in the feminine, which is, on a spectrum, of course, but it's more unconscious for a male. And then I think for women, I would assume that for them, the masculine aspect is going to be the more unconscious aspect. So the work to be done then is really, but that is the conjunction. So last week, I think we saw a quote from Ettinger where he said, if we go deep enough into the psyche, if we go far enough back, what we encounter is really the father and the mother archetype, right? The masculine and the feminine. That the real work is to unite them in sort of an equal way. So there you go.
Thank you.
Duncan, did you have it? Were you going to ask a question?
Yes, I have a question. I have been a long time contra dancer. This is a form of dancing from early American times, sort of traditional barn dancing. It's kind of like square dancing, but it's called contra dancing. And in order to contra dance, two people have to push and pull while swinging and doing other kinds of square dance moves, contra dancing. And so this helps me understand what you're talking about today. It's about integration, isn't it? I'm integrating all of my various aspects to become a whole and fully functional spiritual being. Yeah, brilliant presentation today. Let's just, I don't know if you'll have something to share about that, but
I'll circle back.
We'll go to Patrick also. Come in, Patrick.
Yeah, hello everybody. Thank you for being here. Thank you, Cody. Wonderful presentation. And the clues are all kind of spread out in the big book, but they're clues. and that's why we need sponsors. And if we're lucky, we'll have sponsors who can teach us to decode the clues, just as you have done this evening, right? But then there's other stuff in the big book that kind of put us off the trail, right? So one example would be, for me, for example, having grown up in the kind of very fundamentalist Irish Catholic culture, right? When it says we do a moral inventory, that for me means, okay, this is an inventory where there are two categories, basically, right and wrong, heaven and hell, right? And the implication is that we got to get rid of the wrong stuff, right? But then later in the promises, it says we shall not regret the past nor wish to shut the door on it, right? So another thing to remember is, for me, is important that Bill Wilson himself was a work in progress with every breath he took. So the third step prayer, as it's in the big book, says, take away my difficulties that victory over them may bear witness to those I would help of thy power, thy love, and thy way of life. And later in life, Bill said he suggested that he would prefer to replace the word victory with transcendence. Right? Now, transcendence is more in line with what you have presented this evening than victory. Would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. And I come up against this quite often, actually, and just, I mean, in my own personal life, because I too found myself, like the moral inventory is a great example. The other example was, that we only make amends to people, that it, as long as it doesn't harm them or make them uncomfortable. Like there's a lot of, there's a lot of kind of loopholes, I think, in 12-step spirituality. If you're not real careful, it's easy to fall into them. And I love what you say, that Bill certainly was a work in progress. So is Carl Jung. The truth is, I think that, my understanding is that we get these really, the people who are really sort of engaged with the darkness are the ones who have so much to offer, right? Because it's the trickster versus the shaman. I've spent some time in religion and stuff, and there's, obviously it's such a split, right? And it's, you don't want to even kind of admit to having, fumbled around in the darkness, because, you kind of lose your authority or whatever. So I think it's, I think it's important to point out, I mean, transcendence is so much better than victory, because victory, you're not gonna, there is no victory over darkness, right? There's no victory over, the defects even, but it's like what Duncan said, there's integration. A lot of the images, like in alchemy, and Jung talks about these a lot, is that the symbols are actually like chopped up, and we saw that last week, like they chopped up the king, ground him to powder, and threw him in the oven. And that's the nature of what we're trying to do with these things, is to really kind of separate them and get them, to a place where we can see them, and then work to assimilate them or synthesize them or whatever it is. And so one more thing I think about Bill Wilson that I think is easy to overlook, and having written a book, I can say this, and also I think his approach probably would be similar to mine, sort of this careless approach of just get it down, like let the editors like do their thing. He put out the big book in I don't know, I think 9 months or a year or something. He wrote it. And so I think when you're writing a book, there's this delicate balance between trying to write something that you'll get people to read versus really trying to get really specific and everything like that. And that's, I mean, it's hard to say where Bill's psychology was in 1939. Obviously, it was not where it ended up being in 1955 or 60. You know, he grew a lot over the years. So, but I think what he did present in the early days in the big book is there's enough in there that's so profound and good that it, I mean, obviously, changed the world, you know? So, but I do think it's funny though, then to like, you know, because Bill himself, you know, would recommend some changes, which he, you know, thanks to Shaver, we see that he pointed those out in as Bill sees it, right? Which I love. You know, but this sort of dogma, like in certain AA, you know, groups and stuff about, oh, just it's in the book, it's in the book, it's in the book. You know, it's like, well, some of the stuff in that book is, I wouldn't want to hang my hat on it, like to. But a lot of it I do hang my hat on. So, you know, it kind of goes both ways. So I appreciate that, Patrick.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Fiona. Inviting you to unmute. Try again.
Yeah, sorry. 'Cause I'm on the phone, it's a bit tricky. Yeah, hi. Thank you, Cody. Yeah, you're on fire. Yeah, I suppose I was just kind of musing on the fact of you know, bringing the spirit and the alcohol together, you know, that it isn't a one and done, you know, deal, that you know, being an alcoholic and addict, areas of, I don't know, that, you know, they say it's like guacamole. I know with my own life, you know, I put down one, sorry, my phone declined it. Yeah, you put down one thing, you know, for me it was the food, and then I picked up that, you know, and that became painful, the alcohol. And then when I got into recovery, it's kind of like picking up the shopping. And I was just thinking, well, maybe it is just that step one, and just really wanting that kind of transcendence and having to do step one in all areas of your life. But I just kind of wondered what you thought about that, because yes, it's been the most radical and the most amazing thing in my life that ever happened to me, you know, and but how, you know, the addiction, if you're like me, just comes up in all these areas, even if it's like doing puzzles or whatever, you know. And I've heard other people kind of share on it as well. Have you got anything to say about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that good timing too, by the way. That was perfect. I really like what you're saying. I mean, because obviously we all, I think we all have those things. You know, I mean, I have mine. I certainly do. And you know, I think what it sort of, what it says to me it's a couple things. Like on one hand, like I'm still suffering under the thirst for wholeness, right? Like, you know, Jung said that the most, the real problems in life are never fully solved. And that makes me like really ponder the idea of alcoholism, right? Because I do feel like for me, alcoholism has been solved. I mean, I know that I'm not interested in trying a controlled drink or anything like that. But it's not something that really sort of drives me anymore, but it does manifest in other areas, or it can. And so, and I think that it's just that sort of compulsive complex, right? That, you know, if compulsion is the great mystery of human life, and if the goal is for us to see our compulsions through the lens of the self, in other words, and I love what the Edinger said, you know, that that once we see that our compulsions stem from the self, then when we have compulsions, our whole approach to them changes, because then it becomes a dialogue with the self. And what that looks like, I think, is that it's rather than, you know, if I'm, you know, spending too much money or whatever it is, that when I, when I finally notice that this is happening, then what changes is that I begin to sort of ask sort of my deeper self, like this thing called the self, which we haven't talked about yet, but we're going to in a couple weeks. But I begin to kind of wonder, like, what is it that this entity, this autonomous psychic complex, like, what is it wanting from me? What does it want me to do? What am I still missing, right? What hole am I trying to fill? And so then as we begin to dialogue with the unconscious this way, then the problems begin to become sort of, they fall off, and we discover more of our vocation. So I think it's important in terms of every sort of complex that pops up, every, obsessive compulsive behavior, whatever it is to really try to remember it in terms of sulfur, right? As that, the fire, right? And that it either, because in alchemy and for Jung, in spiritus contra spiritum, it was the compulsion is the thing that transforms us, right? It's the negative component of that compulsive complex is really where the transformative power lies. And so we want to just, rather than try to say, oh, I shouldn't be behaving this way, more it's to dialogue with it and say, okay, what do I do with this? How do I transform this? What good can come of it? So I think something like that. Another really interesting exercise would be to try active imagination on it, right? Is that whatever, so I've found active imagination to be really powerful, because it really gets to that sort of unconscious part, like what am I doing here? Why does this keep happening? And then I give that a symbol, and then I allow that symbol to sort of morph in whatever way it wants to morph, like in my journal. And I'll be damned if it doesn't tend to sort of fix those things on a deeper level. It's almost like magic. It's really woo-woo stuff, but I highly recommend it. So thanks, Fiona.
Thank you. We are at the top of the hour, but can we fit Sharon in?
Sure.
Yes. Come on in, Sharon. Then we'll move toward
Cody,
close.
thank you very much for letting me come in. Woo-woo stuff is what I want to talk about.
Yay.
Really do. You started with active imagination, and then you threaded through some of the mystics. And I came up with the thought, do you know a guy by the name of Henry Nouwen?
Mm-mm.
He was probably in the 50s and 60s. He was a spiritual leader, and he's referred to as the wounded healer. I connected him to your share early on. So if anybody needs to look up Henry Nouwen, he is a wounded healer. He ended his life working with very, very disabled people in Canada I won't go into it anymore. But then you went into this whole thing and you took it all the way through. And my last thing that I had was this idea that even the disease takes on a numinous nature. And that connects with the wounded and the healer that you so beautifully described. I can't tell you how grateful I am for your book study. I could not have read your book and gotten what I'm getting out of your presentations, the clarity of it, even the symbols of the snakes, the positive and the negative coming within that. It's so profound and so beautiful, and I thank you for it. And the last, in your discussion with Fiona, you actually answered the next question, and that is active imagination part of your meditation process? And if it is, how do you go about doing it?
So yes, thank you so much, Sharon. I love seeing you here, and I love your excitement, and I really appreciate your kindness. I really do. So yes, I do make active imagination part of my daily process. And the way I do it, and so it's like really weird, because now that my book is done, I look back on writing it, and it was active imagination. So for me, writing is a huge kind of deal. So I journal, and I'm always looking at my dreams, And what so if you want to know my meditation now, so what I've started to do is catalog my dreams. I have them in a note that I can search, and I pretty much, like, some of those dream images are just really fixed in my mind. And so, and as new dreams appear, I try to connect them to the other dreams. So I'm sort of building a story in my dreams. And that's what I mean when I say that the dream images are the same as the mythological images. Like, if the moon appears to me in one of my dreams, that's Diana, right? So if I want to know what the moon means, like, I can go read all the myths I want on Wikipedia about Luna or Diana or Shakti or whatever, because it's the same, it's really the same image. And so as I do this, then what I've found is that there's something taking place in the unconscious that my ego wouldn't be able to understand anyways, right? The transformation is taking place below the surface. And what we have is the evidence of that bubbling up through active imagination or through dreams or myths. And so it's really telling us about this process that the ego wants to understand, but it can't anyways. So I love, Jung says, sometimes you just have to let the symbols be symbols and just trust that as the symbols are morphing, there's an equivalent transformation taking place below the surface in the energies. So that's my current practice. And I, if anyone's interested, like, I'm happy to try to help and, guide if I can. So, all right, Duncan.
Cody. Thank you, Cody. Thank you so much. Thanks again. Thank you, Ming. Thank you, David. Oh, something took over my screen. Okay, let's